Hi, Misha here, and continuing our look at British jet aircraft. We're going to get to the Hawker Siddeley Hawk, later British Aerospace Hawk. Probably one of the most famous trainers in the world, and more. But before we get to that, wanted to look at the SEPECAT Jaguar. And this is the trainer two-seat variant. And actually these two planes have more in common than you might first realize. The Jaguar was a joint project between France and England to develop an airplane. In the 60s, early 60s, Britain needed a new supersonic advanced trainer. France needed a new economical subsonic light attack strike aircraft. And for some reason, even though these two needs don't really seem that similar, people had the great idea to have a joint project, work together, and basically make two planes on the same design with just, variations. A single seat strike aircraft for France and a two-seat trainer for Britain. To that end, in 1965, a memorandum of intent was signed, kind of like what happened with the Concorde. And in 1966, SEPECAT was founded. And, of course, arguments began because, honestly, both countries were wanting different planes. But nevertheless, a prototype flew in September of 1968. For what it's worth, it was a two-seat prototype. And the idea was to have two production lines, one in France, one in the UK, but only one source for each component. So if a part was made in France, it wouldn't be made in the UK and vice versa. That way there wasn't duplication. But there were two places to assemble them, and that way each country could kind of put them together how they wanted. But by the early 70s, the need started to change. Britain really no longer needed a trainer, but more importantly, it needed a strike aircraft. Originally, it was counting on the General Dynamics F-100K, which never came to fruition. And it waited and waited, and it didn't really have anything for close ground support, nuclear strike, attack, so on and so forth. So it decided, hey, having the combat version wouldn't be so bad after all, and that became its priority. At the same time, France originally had wanted a maritime version for operating off its carriers, but in 1973 it dropped that requirement, so the maritime version of the Jaguar pretty much ended right there. Instead, France would end up purchasing 165 of the single seat, 160 of the single seat, to be used as strike craft, and Britain would purchase 165 single seat and 35 two-seaters for trainers. France would put these into service beginning in 1973, and Britain would follow a year later. Britain would designate the single-seat version initially as the GR1, and the trainer would be the T2. The GR1 would be used, as I said, for close support, also striking, attacking targets behind enemy lines, and a couple of years later it was authorized to carry nuclear weapons as well, so it could be a nuclear strike plane. It's a pretty conventional design, as you see. It's very long, has a relatively short wingspan of about 28 feet, but the plane itself is about 55 feet for the single seat and 57 feet for the two-seat version. It's a long tapered plane. It can reach about Mach 1.6 at altitude, so certainly supersonic. It could get up to about 46,000 feet, so plenty high. It could carry about 10,000 pounds in ordnance with 4 underwing pylons and a 5th pylon under the fuselage. And it was equipped with 2 30mm cannon. Again, a relatively standard plane, but not to say a bad one. They would keep producing these until about 1981. By which time both nations had enough. Counting foreign customers, SEPECAT would produce a little under 550 Jaguars of all types. In Britain, some would be replaced by Tornadoes once that finally came online in the 80s, but other Jaguars would be kept in service throughout the 80s and would serve in the first Gulf War in 1991. They would serve alongside the Tornado and Buccaneer. And actually, once the Buccaneer was retired in 94, some of its former roles and duties were taken over by the Jaguar, which was retrofitted to be able to do them. This would actually lead to the GR3 and GR3A upgrades in the 90s. However, it wasn't long. Its days weren't that long. France would actually retire theirs in 2005. A year earlier, Britain had announced its planning to retire the Jaguar by the end of 2007. And actually, in early 2007, they upped the date to April of that year with very little notice. So by the summer of 2007, they were out of service. But of course, that means it was still in service for well over 30 years. Not bad at all for a project that could have very easily fallen apart altogether, as any international cooperation is wont to do. Like I said, this is the training variant. Kind of neat, I think. By the way, the tail on this moves, which is kind of neat. It has removable underwing tanks. Again, it's a narrow but very long plane. And you wouldn't think of something this big and relatively complex to be related to something so small, simple, deceptively so, as the little Hawk here. But in fact, they are. So let's get to the Hawk. And moving on, as I said, probably one of the most famous training aircraft in the world. And part of that is how successful it has been, and also how versatile and adaptable it's proven. This is the Hawk T1. Originally, it was designed by Hawker Siddeley, and then that was taken over by British Aerospace and it's still being made today under the BAE name. Well, this plane more or less exists thanks to the Jaguar. As I said, in the early 60s, Britain wanted an advanced trainer, and initially that was going to be the Jaguar. But by the late 60s, it was looking less and less likely that it was going to come to fruition, so Hawker Siddeley started working on a trainer of their own in 68. And by 1970, the RAF kind of solidified that, yeah, the Jaguar wasn't going to be a trainer for them for the most part, and that it would need another trainer, and laid out some specs. And then the following year, the Hawker Siddeley design was chosen. At that point, it obviously was kind of well developed and made a lot of sense to adapt it. The prototype first flew in 1974 and entered into British military service in 1976. What do we have here? Well, of course, we have a two-seater. It is one of the smallest planes we've seen in modern days. It's just over 40 feet long. Has a wingspan of about 32 feet. It is reasonably fast. It can get up to about 0.8 Mach. It can cross to about Mach 1.1 in a dive. So it's, I guess, transonic or right at that threshold. Has a pretty good ceiling. You can get up to about 44,000 feet. Fast, nimble little plane. It was designed to be cheap, easy to maintain, easy to work on, a forgiving plane to fly. It had redundancies built in, everything you'd expect of for a dedicated trainer. However, it was also designed to have a secondary role as a light fighter or attack aircraft. To that end, it had 5 hard points, 4 under the wings and 1 under the fuselage, and it could be equipped with missiles, rockets, or gun pods. Actually, in the 1980s, the RAF would do just that. From about 83 through around 86, they would equip about 88 of these that they had with a gun pod and 2 Sidewinder missiles. And they would use them as a short-range interceptor. Effective use of the resources they had. Other nations would do the same. But these are still mostly used for training. Also, they're quite famously flown by the British Red Arrows. In 1981, the U.S. Navy selected this as its next trainer, replacing older T-38s and even T-33s. It would be licensed produced by McDonnell Douglas, adopted as the T-45 Goshawk, and the first trainers would enter into service in 1994. A very successful plane in its own right. Over 1,000 have been produced to date. In fact, these are still in production. Back in 2004, a modernized version with updated avionics was introduced as the T2. It first flew in 2005, and in 2006 the RAF agreed to buy some T2s. and deliveries commenced in 2009. In 2017, it was estimated they had about 75 T1s and 28 T2s in active service, and the T1s are not scheduled for replacement until at least 2030. And the T2s, of course, since they're relatively new, will continue longer than that. It's a testament to just how flexible and upgradable this plane is, that it is still in service. And it's one of the most successful British jets of the latter part of the 20th century. In fact, some customers, foreign customers, that were initially planning to buy the Tornado or Jaguar ended up buying the Hawk, and you would use it as a light fighter. Kind of reminds me of the American F5 Tiger, and it's about the same size, and it has about the same capabilities. So yeah, a neat little plane, and a neat little model from Corgi. They do several different flavors, mostly just different paint schemes. In a way, it was more successful than the Jaguar, and came at a much cheaper cost and was a lot easier to produce. Well, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below and we'll get to them. If you could, like, share, and subscribe, and check out the other videos if you haven't. Otherwise, we're about to hit the home stretch and we'll get to the last few British jets. This is Misha. I'll catch you very soon next time.